Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on deforestation, a climate risk that can be addressed. My name is Nicole Tirico. I'm a program manager with the Intentional Endowments Network, and I'm very pleased to have with me three great panelists to share their experiences on this topic with us all today. During this webinar, we'll be hearing from Leslie Samuelrich, President of Green Century Capital Management, Jeff Conant, Senior International Forest Program Manager at Friends of the Earth, and Matt Piotrowski, a Senior Analyst at Climate Advisors. After our panelist presentations, we'll spend the remainder of the hour in dialogue responding to your questions, so please enter them throughout the presentation in the chat function of the control panel at any time, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. This webinar is being recorded. It will be distributed to all registrants by email and will also be available on our website shortly after it's completed. So you can refer back to this conversation and share it with others. And we will also make the slides available upon request. So just briefly before we dive in, for those of you that aren't familiar with the Intentional Endowments Network, we're a nonprofit collaborative peer learning network with the goal of supporting endowments and enhancing performance by aligning investments with institutional mission, values, and sustainability goals. We do this in a variety of ways, including hosting in-person forums and events, facilitating peer networking, curating useful resources on sustainable investing opportunities, and providing educational venues such as webinars like this one. We encourage you to stay engaged in these conversations after today's webinar. More information on IEN is available on our website, intentionalendowments.org, and you are welcome to reach out to us at any time. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeff.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Nicole and IEN, for organizing this webinar. I will begin by just introducing sort of the big picture of what we're talking about when we're talking about tropical deforestation, and then we'll move into the aspects of tropical deforestation as an investment concern and an investment risk. You can move the slide, Nicole. This is just that was the introductory slide. Tropical deforestation is the third largest driver of the global climate crisis, contributing some 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So when we talk about deforestation, we are really talking about one of the most grave aspects of the climate crisis. It's a climate concern in many ways. We are currently losing about 18 million acres of forest every year, or 40 football fields of forest every minute. That's an area the size of Panama. And you know, we think of trees as sort of a counterpart to humans in the sense that we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. Trees breathe out oxygen and breathe in carbon dioxide. And so standing forests sequester carbon, meaning that when we lose forests, we not only release carbon into the atmosphere, we also lose the carbon capture benefit that trees and forests have. So saving forests has what we call a double benefit. The main drivers of deforestation, and especially tropical deforestation globally, are the big agribusiness commodities: palm oil, soy, cattle, paper pulp, timber, and to some extent, and in some regions, cacao or cocoa. And so when we're talking about deforestation and deforestation risk, we're really talking about agribusiness, large-scale plantation agriculture. And we'll drill down into that as we go forward. Nicole, if you'd move the slide. Of course, one of the crucial aspects of forests is that they are the greatest harbor of biodiversity in the world. And when we lose tropical forests, we lose species at an alarming rate. And these are pictures from some of the regions where we work. The top left picture there is a fish kill in Guatemala due to a spill of palm oil effluent. There were a number of endemic fish species that were lost in this particular incident, and water pollution from agrochemicals is a big aspect of the agribusiness problem and of the impacts on biodiversity. To the right of that, you see a chimpanzee in Liberia. There are Scientific American has shown us that if the palm oil industry expands across Africa the way it's expected to or anticipated to, it will drive African great apes to extinction, and we're already seeing signs of that. Down below there, you see three of our favorite animals from Indonesia. Indonesia being ground zero for the expansion of palm oil and pulp and paper plantations, and we're losing Sumatran rhinos, Sumatran elephants, and this here on the right is a Bornean orangutan saved from a palm oil plantation. Bornean orangutans are being literally driven to extinction by the palm oil industry. And you can move to the next slide, please, Nicole. When we talk about tropical deforestation, we're also talking about the fact that most tropical forests around the world are not only harboring great biodiversity, but great cultural diversity. Indigenous peoples and local peoples have been stewarding tropical forests since time immemorial, and in order to get to the forests, of course, the companies that are wiping them out first need to get a hold of the land, and it's to that extent that we talk about land grabbing as a sort of a key component of the deforestation issue. In the palm oil sector specifically, a typical palm oil plantation requires about 30,000 acres of land to be economically viable. And so that industry encourages land grabs from local communities. This process very often involves corruption, bribery, intimidation, and violence of various sorts. So we, again, see it as fundamentally a human rights problem. The pictures here, the top picture is from Nigeria. This is a community who has lived on some land in Cross River State, Nigeria, for centuries, and an Indonesian palm oil company, Wilmar International, came in and took their land and is developing plantations there. This is them staging a protest. Down below, you have some folks from Central Kalimantan and Borneo, Indonesia, who are holding the land titles to their land, showing that the land that they're standing on is legally theirs. But what you see behind them are palm oil trees planted by a company which took their land. And then the picture from Uganda is a man who was a subsistence farmer in the Kalangala Islands of Uganda and is now employed as a security guard for the company that essentially took his land. And so, yeah, just wanted to highlight the human face of the issue a little bit there. Nicole, you can move on. I'm focusing largely on the palm oil industry because that's the sector that we at Friends of the Earth have been mostly focused on. And for folks who are not familiar, palm oil is pressed from the fruit of the oil palm tree, and because it generates high yields at low costs in countries with lax environmental laws, palm oil is the most widely used vegetable oil in the world. It's found right now in about 50% of all the packaged goods sold in the supermarket. And we have a little sort of a diagram here of how it is that the palm oil industry leads to tropical deforestation and carbon emissions. You have on the left a tropical forest with all of its biodiversity and its carbon storage, and then the companies come in and clear the forest, often using fire, and they release all of that CO2 into the atmosphere, and then they convert the land to a monoculture plantation, which has vastly lower carbon capture capacity than the actual forest itself. And I believe that's my last slide. So yeah, just wanted to give that big picture of what deforestation looks like on the ground. And let me pass it to Matt from Chain Reaction Research.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel, and special thanks to IEN for hosting. My focus will be on financial risk connected to deforestation. Just for some background, I'm an analyst with Climate Advisors, a DC-based policy and research firm that focuses on climate policy, international diplomacy, forest, and capital markets. And we cover deforestation closely because we are part of a consortium called Chain Reaction Research, which follows financial risks connected to deforestation in various markets, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Our partners are Aid Environment and Profundo, both of which are based in Amsterdam. So our focus is a lot of what Jeff just talked about on land clearing connected to the production, buying, and selling of agricultural commodities. As Jeff pointed out, these could be beef, soy, palm oil, and others. So CRR highlights the sustainability and financial challenges from deforestation throughout these sectors. Next slide, please. So firms all along these commodity supply chains are impacted in one way or the other from because of deforestation, from the producers of the commodities to those who trade them, to stores that sell the finished product to consumers, to also the banks that lend to all these different companies. So as you can see on this list here, there are a lot of big names that are exposed to possible deforestation risk, whether they understand that or not. Next slide, please. Here we have a list of companies that have taken financial hits from deforestation commitments, deforestation risks. So the issue that I'm getting at is that sustainability commitments along these agricultural supply chains can improve financial well-being for these firms. So this list here of companies who have been impacted because of connection to deforestation, they include big names such as Sime Darby, Felda, JBS, and IOI Corporation. They've taken financial and also reputation hits because of links to deforestation. Next slide, please. So here I want to focus on IOI Corporation, a gigantic palm oil company that's based in Malaysia. So in 2016, it was suspended from the RSPO. And for those who may not be familiar, the RSPO is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. It's made up of producers, investors, traders, and others, and it certifies whether the palm oil that's produced and sold is sustainable. So IOI's stock price fell sharply. If you can see that the red part in the picture there, that when it was suspended from the RSPO, its stock price fell sharply. And if you look before that, it was very volatile even before the suspension, because reports were coming out about its operations and its links to illegal deforestation, and also news that it might be kicked out of the RSPO. And then after it was able to re-enter the RSPO in August of 2016, its stock, while volatile at times, it's been much more stable than it was before. And that's one example of one company that has been significantly impacted from deforestation. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. So if you look at this back test that was done by climate advisors, it shows that companies in the RSPO significantly outperform those that are not in the RSPO. The premium is 30%. And this highlights how sustainability can significantly can support a company's financial well-being over time. So there are, as I mentioned, a lot of financial and reputational risks that companies need to consider when dealing with commodity supply chains. And just one other thing about this, there are 45 companies that are in this index, Climate Advisors RSPO Palm Oil Index. 45 companies are in RSPO, and there are about 51 that are out. Okay, great. Next slide, please. And the question is, what can investors do? I'm sure we'll get to this in the Q&A, but the main thing that investors can do is to screen companies to make sure that they have a zero deforestation policy and that they follow it. And next, and that is, I'm sorry, next slide, please. Great, thanks. Chain reaction research. If you are not familiar, this are the contact details if you'd like to know more about it. And now over to Nicole.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff and Matt, for such great background and research introducing the topic of deforestation and how it relates to climate risk. I wanted to jump in and take a quick moment to frame the following remarks from Leslie and Jeff in the context of a new resource from IEN, the Intentionally Designed Endowment Roadmap. The visual on this slide offers an overview of the roadmap, which is a step-by-step resource geared toward higher education endowments and their investment service providers on navigating the sustainable investing landscape specific to higher education. It's available in the Education Center of the IEN website, and a link is also on this slide. And the steps in this roadmap can be applied broadly and also to more targeted focus areas. As Leslie and Jeff will share here, there are several steps endowments can take to address deforestation in their portfolios, including learning, as you are all doing by joining this webinar, integrating deforestation language into investment policy statements, assessing the current portfolio with deforestation factors in mind, and then adopting various practices, including but not limited to shareholder engagement and positive and negative screening. So I'll hand it over to Leslie now to share this work in action, but please do keep this framework in mind as we discuss the implementation side and as we move into the Q&A. Leslie?
Thank you, Nicole. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this, and thank you to IEN for organizing it. My comments are in three parts. The first is the understanding the risks and the opportunities. And there's just 2 points I have, which is to have your analysts and PMs read chain reaction research by signing up and other sources so that you become more educated about the risks in these different agricultural supply chains, and then it can be integrated in the ways you feel appropriate. NGOs like Friends of the Earth and others also offer perspectives on this that is helpful to recognize. And so it depends on how in-depth your work on climate risk is and how much you want to learn. But that's step one. On the next slide, we have steps 2 and 3. So this really mirrors a lot of what Nicole just outlined, is that you can use exclusionary screens, and you can use them in a couple ways. You can avoid the companies that don't meet the RSPO standards. You can avoid companies that are in the palm oil supply chain or soy supply chain that don't have zero deforestation commitments. Or you could do a blanket screen, which would not be what I would suggest, but there's a blanket screen available now from MSCI that eliminates all companies involved in the production or distribution of palm oil. We have found that the companies that are addressing the issue from Far East based, or for other companies such as Wilmar, which is the largest palm oil producer in the world, or publicly traded companies like ADM, that when they adopt a zero deforestation agreement, that significantly reduced its risks. So a zero deforestation agreement is one in which they pledge to not source or use any of the commodities grown that are associated with burning or raising down the forests, and that there's a timeline upon which they are finishing their pledge. So it's not an aspirational goal, it's actually a commitment to get rid of the offenders in their supply chains. The second is a pretty standard approach, which is to use the ESG data, which is becoming more robust, but that incorporates climate and deforestation risks. And then the last one is to invest in more sustainable and more climate-friendly solutions. This is just one example, but there are many others out there, depending on your portfolio construction or the consultants you're using. What Green Century has done, starting about 6 years ago, is starting a campaign to address climate change in our own portfolio and in the investment field. And it's a comprehensive program. We work with other investors here in the US through ICCR and Ceres, and work with global investors through PRI, or the Principles of Responsible Investing. And we do and encourage other firms and asset managers to first vote on the proxy ballot questions that are about climate, but specifically about zero deforestation. We and others do a lot of negotiations with companies, but some agreements are not reached before the proxy ballot is in place, and therefore having endowments and institutions use their power on the proxy ballot is really important, and it's an easy first step for all of you to do. 2, that there are investor letters that are shared that you can sign on to, and again, those happen mostly through networks like the ones I mentioned. IEN sometimes circulates those. US SIF also does that, and it is a way to take a second step. So voicing your concern to a particular company about their risks, particularly the ones that you are still invested in, is a good way to join with other investors and learn more about it in terms of what the company and how the company responds, as well as to voice your concern. And then the third, which some people listening on this call may already participate in, but is certainly open for more active participation from endowments and other firms, is to actively engage with companies all across the supply chain. So from growers to the 4 major traders, which are ADM, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus, to the many consumer-facing companies that are sourcing palm oil, beef, soy, and other commodities that are a problem. And a lot of success has been had. If people saw most recently, Green Century had success with Aramark, which you may recognize from supplying meals to your college or schools or stadiums or hospitals. They didn't have any kind of approach on these agricultural commodities, and in fact, didn't have much of a sustainability reporting profile to begin with. And when we approached them, they were pretty eager to learn more about the issues. And by the end of our negotiation, and we announced an agreement that puts them on the path to eliminating deforestation in their supply chain. And so there are opportunities for other firms to join in. We did that engagement with New York State Pension Fund, and are working with other large institutions as well. So we really encourage you to activate your portfolio and make a difference to reduce the risk and to make a real world impact. I am now going to turn it over to Jeff, who's going to give some more examples of activities that have been successful in addressing deforestation and supply chain.
Thank you, Leslie. I will briefly run through sort of the approach that Friends of the Earth has taken with some of the large institutional investors that are holders of deforestation risk companies. That complements, I think, what Leslie just walked us through. And we think that investors really need to have clear policies and due diligence practices to address deforestation risk across their portfolios. There's no one-size-fits-all policy or approach, but institutional investors are beginning, just like with climate, are beginning to institute policies and practices, whether it's disclosing the risks or proxy voting guidelines, as Leslie sort of described, or direct engagement policies. And in our work, we're not so much focused on the consumer-facing brands in deforestation supply chains like PepsiCo, Nestle, Kroger, Yum brands, many of which you can, so it's actually a few of those are up for proxy votes this year. But we're focused on the large Southeast Asian agribusiness producers and traders, the ones that are directly causing the deforestation, with names like Sime Darby, IOI, Wilmar, Golden Agri Resources, some of the names you saw in Matt's slides. And the three firms that I name on this slide have been among the top holders in the US of the big deforestation risk palm oil producers. And so we've engaged with each of them to different degrees, with different degrees of, I'd say, constructive engagement. And one of them, TIAA, which has been one of the largest holders of deforestation risk commodities, we've found has quietly dropped their palm oil and other forest risk commodity holdings between 2015 and now. And I say quietly because we haven't seen any kind of public announcement or any specific policy related to this. And I know we have someone from Nuveen TIA on the call, so it would be interesting to hear from you about if this was an intentional decision or how this has come about. And one of the ways that we've been working in and around this is working with academics at universities across the country to develop faculty senate resolutions and to develop awareness among academics of the fact that there has been palm oil in their retirement funds. Another firm that we've been engaged with, Dimensional Fund Advisors, dropped palm oil from its sustainability portfolios. Just like many firms, Dimensional has social choice funds or sustainability funds, as they call them. And in 2017, they screened palm oil entirely out of those funds, which we think was a good move. They're still broadly exposed to the Southeast Asian trader producers. And part of how that came about is that Dimensional manages funds for a lot of municipal retirement funds around the country, and we engaged with those funds to ask them, do you want your beneficiaries exposed to the financial risks from deforestation and human rights abuses? And many of them engaged directly with Dimensional and basically created a deforestation-free option for their clients. And then CalPERS is really the leader in this sector. In 2018, CalPERS adopted a sector-leading policy. We've been working with them closely for a couple of years on this, and they now are the first institutional investor in the US that recognizes deforestation and land rights as material financial risks. They're actively engaging with all of the deforestation risk companies in their portfolios. They've been part of the engagement with the RSPO that Leslie sort of spoke to, where investors holding trillions in assets have been asking the RSPO to improve its standards. It's a sector leading policy. And so we would recommend all investors to look at what CalPERS is doing and consider moving in that direction. And you can move to the next slide, Nicole. I think this is just me wrapping up. These are a couple of resources that we have on foe.org. We have information and resources about deforestation broadly and how to support the work we're doing. We also have a site in partnership with As You Sow called deforestationfreefunds.org, where you can look at your mutual fund's exposure to the palm oil sector. And we're hoping to expand that site this year to cover the other deforestation risk commodities. So I'd ask you to have a look at that. And with that, I think I'm passing it back to Nicole.
Great. Thank you so much for those wonderful presentations, and for all of our panelists. If you could go ahead and take yourselves off mute, we'll jump into some questions here. And for our audience, please do continue to type your questions into the chat box in the control panel, and we'll get to as many as we can. So to kick us off, a question for Matt and Jeff. Are there issues of transparency and/or availability of relevant information and metrics from these companies? And what resources would you recommend for those wanting to learn more?
Yeah, Matt, do you want to dive in?
I'll defer to you first. Yep.
Sure. I mean, I'd say broadly speaking, there has been great progress over the last several years, thanks to civil society engagement and investor engagement. There's been actually tremendous progress to get, mostly in the palm oil sector, but increasingly across commodities, to get the brands and producers and traders to trace their supply chains. One of the main asks that we've been making for years of the industry is traceability of supply chains and transparency, by which we mean in order to mitigate the problems of deforestation and human rights abuses, we need to know where all of the palm oil, all of the soy, all of the beef is coming from. And certainly about 10 years ago, the companies themselves couldn't tell you that. Nestle couldn't tell you where they were getting their palm oil from. Now you can go to the websites of the Nestle's and a bunch of the other companies, not all of them, and find, if you know where to look, exactly where they are sourcing their palm oil from. And we think this is going to expand to some of the other commodities. Does that mean that they're proactively wanting, the market and their competitors to know this information? Not really. It's still fairly opaque. And in my view, investors aren't looking for this information as actively as they should. But resources, and I think Matt will add to this, but there's a site called supplychange.com, I think it is, supply change, as not chain, that rates companies on their deforestation risk. There's another, the London Zoo, ZSL, has a tool called SPOT, the Sustainable Palm Oil Transparency Toolkit, which I think is very useful for investors to look at the companies. Chain Reaction Research, as Leslie mentioned, puts out very great information on financial risk. There's Script, which is a sort of a screening tool, which Matt may be more familiar with than I am. And I could go on. There are a lot of resources, not from the companies so much, but from civil society. Matt, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think that was a great summary from Jeff. I would just echo what he said, that the way we have regarding traceability now is much better. We have satellite images that can track where deforestation is taking place. And the fact that a lot more companies are providing their supplier list is also a big step regarding transparency. But companies can get around this through like indirect suppliers and other measures too. And I think that this is why it's important that investors and civil society continue to put pressure on these companies to be more transparent, so we can decide, that we in general can decide for ourselves whether they are meeting their commitments or not.
Yeah, I would also, if I can jump back in, say that the sort of industry provided ESG metrics do not, they don't live up to their reputation, I guess I'd say. I think I really appreciate Leslie saying, look to NGO reports. I mean, we, Friends of the Earth, other groups, Rainforest Action Network, climate advisors themselves, have ears on the ground in many countries, and a number of engagements that I've had with institutional investors, they say, look, our ESG data doesn't match what you, Friends of the Earth, are telling us. And we say, look, your ESG data is coming from people sitting at desks in Switzerland, and our data is coming from people on the ground in Indonesia and in West Africa and so forth. So you obviously have to be critical about every information resource you use, but NGO data is really often coming from the front lines and is very valuable.
Great. And an open question sort of building off of that and the growth and availability of third-party and NGO data. How have you each seen the uptake in addressing deforestation change while working on this issue? Have you seen any change since the UN SDGs were released? And how does deforestation relate more broadly to the SDGs as well?
Well, life on land is particularly relevant as a STG that applies to deforestation. And we started working on the issue 6 years ago, and with the support of Ceres back then, and I don't know of many investors that were working on it in the specific agricultural commodity way. There were some, certainly some were analyzing it, but it has significantly picked up since then with, again, the players that Jeff mentioned, the larger pension funds being involved. There are a lot of global investors who are involved, particularly through PRI. They have two task forces or steering committees, one on palm oil and one on general deforestation, that again are supported by Ceres as well. And those groups are quite active both in Southeast Asian work, in Latin American work, and now there's a new initiative on working with the companies that have not been willing to adopt zero deforestation agreements. In Southeast Asia, about 25% are not in that and covered by agreements, to actually pressure the banks and other financing sources as a way to pressure the companies to come into a more standard sustainability model. So I think that there are a lot more resources, there's a lot more activity. That does not mean that we don't need more investors to get involved and both incorporate it into their own decisions or to join in some way on the engagement side.
Yeah, I would add, this is Jeff, the Norwegian pension fund, some of you may have seen the news, has divested from almost all of its palm oil holdings, which is quite significant, but I think maybe more significant. They did that after very aggressive engagement with all of the companies, and that's essentially what we recommend, is use your shareholder power to try to bring change in the sector, and if that is not forthcoming, then don't hesitate to divest. You're not going to lose any money, that's for sure. So the Norwegian pension fund is a great example to follow. CalPERS on the SDGs, when CalPERS adopted their deforestation risk language, they did it, I believe, specifically because they'd made a board level decision to support the SDGs, and then saw, well, what does that mean? Part of what that means is addressing the life on land in SDG, I think it's 15. And then, I mean, as Leslie noted, and as we've noted, a lot of the companies in these sectors now have policies on paper. Some of these policies are very good, but what we've seen is implementation is really lagging, and it's very difficult to track the implementation of the deforestation commitments on the ground. So while we see a lot of great dynamic movement in the sectors, we have not actually seen a drop in deforestation, and that's obviously the goal we're going for, and that's where stronger investor pressure and stronger due diligence and really using some of the resources that are out there to make sure that companies are not just talking a good talk, but actually implementing their commitments is really where we need to be.
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Jeff just said about deforestation rates rising in each of the Amazon, in each of the countries in Latin America where the Amazon is. Deforestation rates have really picked up in the past few years, and so even though this issue has gotten a lot more attention from investors, from the press. I mean, last week there was a big story in The Economist, and the end of last year there's a big story in the New York Times magazine about it. So it's getting a lot more attention in the investment community, financial community, of course, among NGOs and in the press, but we're still seeing a sharp rise in many places.
Right. I would point out a different part of it, which is that deforestation rates in Southeast Asia and Indonesia have declined, but they've been balanced out by rises in Latin America.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, one, because I just wanted to share that fact. And two, because that most of the investor engagement has been in and around the Southeast Asian palm oil supply chain to be encouraging that investor and NGO engagement has made an impact there. But as many others are, we're also turning our attention to the Cerrado area in Brazil and other countries where a lack of protection and lack of company agreements has been a problem.
And when talking about doing more, Leslie, could you share more about how endowments can support shareholder engagement on deforestation with limited time and resources and via external managers, specifically what that looks like and what first steps could be?
Sure. I mean, I would go back to the points we outlined to keep it simple, which is start looking at it in the investment decisions and look for the lower risk companies involved in, okay, there's a weird noise happening somewhere. And look for that and pass it on to the analyst and encourage your consultants to look at it. I do not think that this issue has hit the big consultants in terms of a climate risk one, but one that they can actually find a lot of information on. And then the second is that is really to vote on the proxies in ways that support the existing investor shareholder work that's happening. Not all of it is making it to a proxy, but an endowment voting its proxy can make a big difference, especially if there's a large number of endowments from IEN doing so.
And a little bit of a targeted follow-up question. I'm not sure if anyone would even really be comfortable answering this, but what the best sectors and companies in public equities to engage on this topic, or if not sharing specific companies, good places to start for collaborative engagement efforts on voting proxies.
Collaborative engagement efforts. Well, the proxy advisor impact report just came out this week. And that showcases a number of different issues and how to get involved. ISS and Glass Lewis cover these issues, and so you can get briefings from there. Green Century is obviously a very specific but resource. We're happy to provide information. And I believe that you could get information from Ceres if you're a member and PRI if you're a member there as well. I think the easiest companies to engage with are the US-based consumer-facing companies, and while many do have zero deforestation agreements, there are many that don't. And I'd be happy to talk offline with potential investors who are interested in, investors who are interested in potential engagement about. Really, it would be gearing up for next year to start having to join dialogues or join investor letters for next fall, because the shareholder advocacy season runs like a college. You get ready in the summer, and then you do a lot of kickoff work in the fall to get ready for the big meetings or exams in the spring, which are now.
I would add on that, if I can, this is Jeff again, that yeah, the easiest and most straightforward to engage with are going to be the U.S. Public sector companies. One of the challenges is that a lot of portfolios are, and especially passive portfolios, are filled with the large Southeast Asian traders, again, who we're engaging with, which are often listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange or Kuala Lumpur or Hong Kong, and so they're not subject to the same proxy voting processes, and so they really require direct engagement from investors. And what we've seen is that a lot of those companies don't respond to direct engagement, so that's where some kind of collective engagement would be extremely helpful, to have a number of large investors get in dialogue with some of those companies. I think would would be very helpful. And then there's a sort of a hidden area that we're hoping to get a little more action on, which is the big Southeast Asian banks and even the US banks, which appear in a lot of portfolios, many of which finance private deforestation risk companies that are not accessible to you as fund managers, but the banks themselves may be accessible to you because you may hold them in your portfolios. So getting the big Southeast Asian banks to adopt deforestation risk lending policies is an important frontier that we should be thinking about.
Great. And I actually just have one last question. So could you each share a call to action or call for further learning or any other closing remarks for those listening in today, looking at these issues mainly through an investor lens, but also potentially through an institutional purchasing and sourcing lens as we're talking to colleges and universities?
What was the last part, Nicole? One was the investing lens, and what was the second part?
Also through institutional purchasing and sourcing.
Well, my kickoff would be to think about climate risk is largely a huge risk facing your portfolios and firms and organizations. And very often climate risk has been thought about as engagement with fossil fuel companies or engaging around sourcing renewable energy. But with deforestation being the third largest driver of climate change, to repeat one of Jeff's points earlier, that including it in a climate change risk scenario and portfolio would be the first step to recognize it as an important issue for the endowment to address. And then I think the other steps follow out of it, just depending on what the endowment and its trustees are doing in terms of investing and engaging. And I would say there are choices to be made on the purchasing end. And so purchase companies that have zero deforestation agreements where that's available. I mean, it's good to support those companies and to tell them why that you are using those companies' products.
Yeah, this is Jeff, I would absolutely echo all of that. And I would say if you're looking to, first you want to find out what you're exposed to, and our site Deforestation Free Funds can be very useful in that regard. So I'd say go there and have a look. We really need to see the big institutional investors, the big guys, Vanguard, Fidelity, State Street, BlackRock, instituting policies around this, and it's clear that they will only do that when there's consumer demand. And if we can get, college endowments across the country asking for deforestation-free options, vehicles, that will be an important driver of change.
Yeah, I would agree with what Leslie and Jeff have just said. And to Leslie's point, a lot of when we think of climate change, we think of the fossil fuel companies, and we all know who they are. But when it comes to deforestation risks, it's not always as apparent, and the names aren't as big. But we can, I think it's just important to get educated about what companies are at risk and to learn more about them and ultimately engage with them.
Great, thank you all. And I'm very hopeful that this webinar is a great starting point for these conversations for those listening and those that may listen to this recording as we continue to have these conversations within the network. And thank you so much to Matt, Leslie, and Jeff for the great discussion, and to all of our participants for joining us this afternoon. If you have any questions about this webinar, the work of our panelists, or activities happening in the Intentional Endowments Network, please do be in touch. And Again, this webinar will be up on our website shortly. We'll also include links to many of the resources mentioned throughout this call in a follow-up email with the recording. So thank you again and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks.